Thank you very much for coming out, everybody. My name's Omar, and it's a pleasure to be here with Suki Kim, who's the author of what I think is one of the most astounding pieces of nonfiction investigative journalism I've read in a very long time. I'm not going to go through all of the honors that you've received because we're going to be here for a while, but I will say that she's a Guggenheim Fellow in fiction, a Fulbright Fellow in nonfiction, in addition to Without You There Is No Us, which is her nonfiction account of going undercover in North Korea. She has also authored a novel called The Interpreter, which is just very, very good. In addition to being a really good murder mystery, is just a terrific novel about belonging and unbelonging. I loved it. You will too. It's downstairs. Before we get started with the Q&A, and we will go to an audience Q&A at the end, I think Suki has a sort of slideshow for us, and I'll let you take it away.
Hi, thank you for all showing up, and thank you for that introduction. Before we really begin talking, let's just, I'm not sure how the logistics work with this, but, because all the lights are on. Can we have, is it possible to have, can you see the screen? Oh. So, well, it's the great leader. You know, here we go. So, can we play the song, please? Oh no. I guess this happens. I mean, at least it's happening here, not in. That was the song "Without You There Is No Us," which ended up being, so I ended up actually using it as a title of the book. So when you look at that video, it's pretty clear to you what kind of world that is. You know, there's really the only one thing in that world, which is a great leader. That was our former great leader. There have been 3 of these great leaders. Currently, we have Kim Jong-un, who just conducted, whose nation just conducted the 6th nuclear test. And just shot up a missile a couple of days ago. But that's an ongoing theme when it comes to North Korea. So to really get into this world, my journey began back in 2002 when I went in there posing as a Kim Jong-il loyalist for his 60th birthday celebration. I was there at that time 8 days, which is just not enough time. But I got to see a sort of a world that just devastated me in many ways, that followed their famine of the 90s, which killed a tenth of the population. So from then on began this journey, and that was about a decade long when I kept going in under different contexts where you only really get to see just a few days of propaganda. So it was pretty clear that I needed to live in that world, embedded, if I wanted to get at any deeper meaning of the place and understand the place. So I just want to start showing you just quick images, and we can have more in-depth conversation of this world, which is considered the most isolated world, and also the most brutal nation in the world. One thing from that images you saw, from that song, you saw that, you know, it was not only about the great leader, but it was also about the hatred of the United States, which is at the root of North Korea. So now, this is a NASA satellite photo, which, as you can see, the blackness is North Korea. So if you were to have actually the whole world, entire world, the one black spot is North Korea. And people constantly compare it to China, Cuba, Germany. I'm sorry, there's no world like this in this contemporary 2017. So how do I do this? Okay, here we go. So crimes against humanity. This was a United Nations official statement a couple of years ago by Michael Kirby. The gravity, scale, and nature of these violations reveal a state that does not have any parallel in the contemporary world. So we've seen pictures like this constantly, where the great leader just rules over because he's the only thing that exists. There have been 3 generations. So it began with Kim Il-sung, who really was handpicked by, you know, Russia. And then follows Kim Jong-il, who rose to power in 1994 and died in 2011, the year that I was in North Korea living there. So I was in the country when he died. And then Kim Jong-un rose to power, who is the youngest leader in the world. So when you arrive in North Korea, you have to bow to his country, because the great leader is the son of the entire nation. Every single books are about him or by him. Every song is also about him. Every newspaper article is about him. Only one television channel, only about him. And they also take this juche, which is a self-reliance, it means, the philosophy that is founded by the great leader, and you learn that every single day. So every citizen has to wear the pins at all time, and if you were to, God forbid, drop it, then, you know, I mean, I've seen my student, because I was posing as a ESL teacher when I was living there, undercover, you know, when this pen can drop, and it's just they were devastated, because it's actually, you can get punished for that. So you can see that all have it on their chest, because it's closest to a heart. It's why because great leader is your heart. So the violations against humanity, you know, none of the numbers are ever certain, but there are gulags, political gulags, throughout the country. The number is between 10 to 20, and it's just basically nearly lifetime gulag sentence. About 200,000 people are meant to be in those gulags, but we can't verify any of those numbers. That's Chang Sung-taek, who was current great leader's uncle. So of course, Kim Jong-un, when he rose to power at the end of 2011, one of the first things he did, 2013, he was also practically raised by Chang Sung-taek because his father was busy. So Chang Sung-taek had been #2 guy in North Korea for about 40 years or so. One of the first things he did was get his uncle executed. So Chang Sung-taek was pulled from a meeting and killed. It was one of the first current great leaders act. Then of course, he had his brother assassinated. That's Kim Jong-nam, who was meant to be, because he was the first son, meant to have been the next great leader. But for whatever reason, he was banished from about 2003 onward. And just now, he was killed a couple of months ago at the Kuala Lumpur airport, where they detonated one of the VX agent, which they call one of the most murderous chemical agents. So chemical weapon was actually used to kill his own brother, blood brother. So now, with currently there are 3 Americans being detained there. And I was when I was there, my cover was a fundamental evangelical Christian and an ESL teacher. The university where I was at, 2 of the current detainees are from that university where I was at. He was the 4th one, Otto Warmbier. We all know what happened to him. He went there and he took down a poster. And however, I want to clarify, posters in North Korea are not posters. It's kind of like swastika or, KKK symbol. I mean, these are symbols that enslave the people. So it's also meant to be holy. So the ignorance of that nation of what a grave crime that is, Otto Warmbier had no idea, but also he had no idea what he was walking into, because North Korea is not a holiday spot. He came out in a coma and died within days. So this administration has said that they got him out. Nobody really got him out. North Korea released him because it was about to die. So they released him so that he doesn't die in North Korea, but in America. But the brutality of that is another thing another reminder of what we're dealing with. I wrote a piece about that where tourism in a currently living gulag, really, I didn't really understand why that was happening, because it's torture porn. Because you don't go backpack into a gulag. So then, of course, following what happened to Warmbier, the US has now put a travel ban. It's another problematic measure, however, but we can talk further on that, but it's certainly not a tourism destination. So this is Pyongyang Airport back in 2002 when I first walked in, where for the 60th birthday celebration of the great leader, and the guide was holding up a sign, the son of the 21st century. The son, meaning the great leader. So this was then the great leader statue that I had to go bow. That's the train, great leader train. But this was also one of the displays at the great leader flower exhibition that I was taken to, where I had to look at displays by every organization in the entire country that had used these flowers. Those red flowers that look like Christmas flower, that's actually the Kim Jong-il flower. So great leaders have their own flowers, specially invented. So the exhibition was about the great leader flowers, they just went on and on and on and on and on, because everybody was celebrating the great leader flowers. The train, Kim Jong-il was meant to have died in one of those trains. In truth, did he die there or not die there? Because he was always traveling. The propaganda was because he was trying to overlook the well-being of his people. So this train was a symbol of, again, great leaders' solicitude, which is what they call it in North Korea. That's a great leader flower, typical great leader flower exhibition. But I saw hundreds of those for hours and hours and hours. And it was basically the same thing over and over and over again. And that, by the way, is how things are in North Korea, because you can only talk about the same thing over and over and over for 75 years. That's the Juche Tower. Juche is a self-reliance. So that tower is a symbol of North Korea. It's in the middle of Pyongyang, but sort of another example of that is kind of everywhere. So that was when the whole nation seemed to be out dancing in just minus 20, whatever, 30 degrees. It's incredibly cold in North Korea in winter. This is February, was Kim Jong-il's birthday. So they were dancing like that from like 8 a.m. until 8 p.m. Voluntarily, supposedly. But clearly people have been rounded out to celebrate the great leader. They even have a song called February is Not Spring. February is spring, but February is actually winter, right? But it's actually spring there because great leader was born. So all the children were rounded up to dance in this mass game stuff, which I think anybody who's been to Pyongyang for a couple of days, they end up all loading onto YouTube these mass games. And it's actually after about 5 minutes of it, all you're seeing is just children forming great leader petal, flower petal, or like a sickle, or whatever it is. I found it kind of unbearable to see, because it's basically child labor. these are the great leader, the Workers' Party leader guys. So my first time I had to stay and basically be with them all the time because I was meant to be a great leader loyalist who have come to honor his birthday. So I had to do karaoke with these guys, which was kind of an impossible mission because I didn't know what kind of song to sing. That wouldn't be that would be allowed in North Korea because nothing is allowed there. That's a building in Pyongyang, which is another one of those signs. This one says, "We are happy." That was my certificate when I got hired, which took me about 3 years of pursuit of this organization to persuade them to get them to hire me, unpaid. It was a fundamental evangelical organization that was setting up a university in Pyongyang. That was my appointment letter. That was a campus. That bridge, walkway, really made sure everything was seen everywhere. There was nowhere. It's basically all of this was it. So you are watched everywhere you go. There was nowhere that was private. My room was bugged. Outside, the minders were living in those buildings. There was just nowhere to go. So that was me teaching in a class with great leader portraits on the wall, which is also in every room, by the way, great leader portraits. So everything is done in groups. It was kids, not kids, my students were about 19 and 20-year-olds, young men. I lived in a campus with 270 young men and guarded by military, and I was never allowed to leave. And they were also never allowed to leave. So we were in this setting for months and months and months and eating together and playing basketball together, and they just became really almost like my children. So that building you see at the end, the square, is a great leader-ism, I believe it was Kim Il-sung-ism study hall, where you study the study of the great leader. And that tower is a tower of immortality you see in Pyongyang everywhere. So the tower has a message, our great leader is eternally with us. So basically the two symbols in the campus was also the great leader. That was them taking, I believe, final exam. Electricity was cut even there. This was a privileged place because the foreigners put up money for it. However, electricity got cut almost every day. So I remember that test. We couldn't begin the test because light was out and the winter was so dark, they couldn't see the test paper. So we just waited and waited until it was a little bit lighter outside so they can see it from the daylight. That's an election booth, which we were taken. The teachers were taken on this great leader related, because anything is great leader. It doesn't matter where you go, because it's all about the great leader. But we were taken on a trip to an election booth on an election day. Now, they don't have an election. So the whole thing, and encouraged to take pictures. So it was to show us they have an election when they actually don't have an election. And so we were also taken to a church. To show us they have a freedom of religion, which they do not. So I went with the colleagues who are the teachers at this fundamental evangelical school, who are, so the catch is fundamental evangelical people are in there to bring Jesus to this land where Jesus is not allowed. But they had to, in order to do that, they had to make a pact that they're going to kind of never talk about religion. So in a way, the regime knows that they're Christians, but they're kind of pretending not to be Christians because they can't really talk about any of it, right? So when I went there, and I was pretending to be a fundamental Christian, but I'm not a fundamental Christian. I'm not Christian at all. So I was pretending to be them who are pretending not to be Christian. So there were a lot of this double layer of very, very identity lying, essentially. And then when we went there, however, there were North Koreans pretending to be Christians because they're not Christians. So I was in a church with a set of people who are not Christian pretending to be Christian, and the Christians, real Christians, who were pretending not to be Christian. So I didn't really understand what this church, who this church was for. So they were all singing like that. And I really, at some point, thought, looking at them, really singing earnestly, and I thought, clearly they don't believe any of what they're singing. And I wonder if for them, maybe it's like karaoke, it's like a job mission, just come and sing hymns and kind of pretend to be Christian. So wherever you go in North Korea, you are taken to a mountain, and it's all filled with a great leader slogan like that. inscribed directly onto the mountain. One of the most famous mountains. That was everything about North Korea is a daily heartbreak. But to see the nature also belonging to great leader, this mountain is one of the most famous mountains in Korea, which South Koreans are never allowed to see. Obviously, they can't cross it. North Koreans are also not allowed. Mountain's empty. And there's thousands of these. There was not a single place you can go within a mountain that didn't have the great leader markings. So that was one of the last sites I think I saw of my students against the great leader building and the Tower of Immortality. This is when I finally got them to watch Harry Potter next to the great leader slogans. And that was a struggle, but we can talk further about that. And this is on my last day, Kim Jong-il died. So that's a cover from that day's newspaper, which then I got yelled at on the plane for folding, because I didn't know how to carry a newspaper without folding it. But you're not supposed to fold the great leader images. But that was not planned. When I found out that great leader died, I really thought, wow. I mean, part of me was, it was a very complicated feeling after having been there for so many months. But of course, as a writer, I thought, here's my final chapter. Perhaps there is God after all. But we can now discuss further about this. I'm sorry, there was one more video that I just wanted to see before we begin talking. Why don't we show that? So those are my students just walking to the cafeteria, singing the songs of the great leader 3 times a day. Okay, let's...
I'm sure that you're sick of answering this question, but I have to ask. You make the decision as an investigative reporter to cover what is essentially one of the toughest stories that you can get, to go into perhaps the most isolated place on earth. You know full well the consequences of what happens if things go wrong. Why did you do this? What was the driving force to go do something where the risk is so high?
You know, that is a complicated one to answer. I think because we're not allowed to say I'm not sure why, but there's an element of that. Not that I don't know the consequences, but why am I driven to this? There were multiple reasons. I was born and raised in South Korea, and my grandmother did lose her son during the war, who was 17, and he ended up in North. We're from the South, but he ended up in the North during the war, taken to North Korea, all the witnesses said. And because Seoul and Pyongyang is about 3 hours in distance by car, she just thought he was just going to kind of come home next week. And this wall that they built, 38th parallel DMZ, just did not ever, that generation didn't know that this was forever, because there had never been a division between North and South. So I think this idea of that kind of forced separation, I can't imagine anything worse than that as a mother or as anybody, to spend your life waiting for someone who was never going to come home. It's very different from death. And knowing he's right there on the other side and looking, like wanting to come home and can't. So I think this has haunted me, but this is not unusual. I mean, this is what the tragedy of the Korean War was, but that in Korea, it's like every other person you meet, and they'll say, oh, I know, this happened in my family also. So what that means is millions of people on either side of this division who just long for the answer. In movies, the wall comes down and people unite. That just never happened to this generation. And I think as a writer, I kept thinking, But supposedly there should be an answer. You know, writers write about it in movies, and these endings come. The ending never came in that whole generation, including my grandmother, who never moved our house because she thought he needs to find his way back home when he comes home, died of heartbreak. And I think what happens if an entire generation dies and there was no record of this sorrow? And I think I was haunted by that idea. But then also I went there in 2002 and I couldn't believe this world. They talk about hunger, whatever outside, but it's not about that. It's the fact that you go in and there is this world of cult great leader stuff. Also, you can't go anywhere, a minder's with you. I mean, if you were to describe to me what is your nightmare as a thinking human being, it was unfair. And I couldn't believe the world wasn't all trying to free this somehow. So I think obsession began. And it got worse than that obsession because any chance I got, there was no way to write about it as a writer. And I think that it became one of those things where I remember telling my dad at some point after one of the visits, I said, Dad, I think I might have to go. Oh, what happened? What is this? Who's talking to me?
I think we're still being monitored. Is that what's happening? You're not doing a very subtle job of it.
So I was like, wow, it's like definitely someone's watching over me now. But I did tell my father, I think I have to go live there. Mm-hmm. And my dad said, like he just said, well, first of all, it's insane, but also he was like, this just isn't going to happen. So I think it was a combination of that, of not wanting to pursue it, but pursuing. But I did think there was less than 5% of coming out alive.
And you did it anyway.
You know, by then it had been a decade of pursuit. And I interviewed so many defectors in all surrounding regions, people who flee, but, you know, Chinese border, Thailand border, Mongolia, South Korea, and hearing their stories and comparing notes, how much of this is true, and what is this desperation. And also, everything about North Korea is like a fog. So because you can't verify any of it as a journalist, I think that your drive to somehow get the truth of any of this becomes that much more urgent.
So one of the things I found fascinating was this sort of double layer camouflage that you wear, that you talked about, this idea that you're there pretending to be an ESL teacher who's pretending to be an evangelical Christian, who's pretending not to be an evangelical Christian. And I imagine that was difficult to maintain. But one of the things it's an incredibly authentic book, but your relationship with your students, you're posing as their teacher, but this relationship is incredibly authentic, and you can't help but feel that you deeply care for these students. I'm just wondering, what was it like when you first met them? What were their personalities like, and how did your relationship with them evolve?
You know, I wondered if this kind of investigation really requires some sort of compartmentalization, because so when we're talking about fact and fiction, you know, there was so much element where, first of all, my own identity here is a lie, but my feelings on this topic is more sincere than anything I've ever felt. Then I think that my gaze at them was really, I think from the beginning, with love. Because if I didn't think this was as important, I wouldn't have spent all that time and pursued every way. I mean, it's so hard and scary. You know, I'm not like a war correspondent. Like there are those type of very fearless creatures, and I wasn't that. So I mean, I was petrified all the time. And then, like, if email came from an organization I was pursuing, looking like I might be able to get in, my heart would just sink because it was terrifying. But I think that, and that's how I felt the first time I went. I just wept the whole time, those 8 days. At night, I couldn't cry during the day because I was always with those Workers' Party leader guys. So out at night, I would cry because I felt like it's like this land is all blood, because how many people have cried here? And how many people, it's like their voices are not ever going to be heard. So it's kind of that nightmare of being stuck in a gulag, a concentration camp, and no one will ever know what you are feeling in there, how much you cried. And I think that feeling then there is some sort of like, it sounds so grand than I intend, but like kind of a love for humanity. So I think when I met my students who are going to be the young men, who also I'm gonna write about, you know, as a writer, and I think my feeling for them was just, how do you live here? Like, so I need to understand this world, but also as a human being, I think my heart just melted in a way, which of course then I did fall in love with all of them.
Because, I mean, just for context, we're talking about essentially the MIT of North Korea that you're teaching at.
So the setup was in 2011, which was the year 100. Because they count, the calendar system is counted differently. It begins with the birth of the original great leader. So even if it's 2011 outside, there it's year 100. And they decided to shut down every university in the whole country for a nation as a means of celebration, believe it or not, to then put all the university students to construction fields so that they do just manual labor. And the real reason is to not let them gather, because this was obviously an important year.
That's
Here we
what
go.
it is.
That's
okay.
what it is.
They'll come and usher us out, I'm sure.
So they shut, you know, that year, regime change was coming. And even then I knew something big was happening here, because if all university students are being sent to construction fields, but of course the Workers' Party leaders did not want their sons in construction fields. So then they plucked the best of the best, creme de la creme of North Korea, which were 207 hand-picked young men from their best schools. Their best schools are Kim Il-sung University and Kim Chek University. These are Harvard and MIT of North Korea. They plucked them all out of there, transfer them into this brand new school funded and operated by the foreigners who are the International Organization of Fundamental Evangelical Christians. Essentially, fundamental evangelical Christian money was used to educate the future leadership of North Korea. It's an incredibly bizarre premise. But so this was the setup of that year. So these students were, I didn't know who they were until, of course, I went in when I met them, and I soon figured out who they were, and I realized it was 19 and 20-year-old future leadership.
Mm-hmm. But you're at a science and technology university, and a lot of the kids have not heard of the internet.
They didn't know what it was in 2011. And I mean, the amount they go, it's like the election booth and the church that they show you. I mean, that world operates that way. So the school officials showed us students sitting in front of a computer with a Google page open. Like, see, we are on the internet all the time. But then I'm living with them, sharing 3 meals a day with them. And at some point, you know, they think the intranet is internet. And at some point, they say things like, oh, are you able to see 5 movies on internet? You're able to see 10 movies. So the concept of infinity was not there. So I mean, that kind of stuff, even if you all pretend you know what it is, it's pretty soon you figure out. But if you were to ask any of them, they would all say, yes, we know what the internet is. They had no concept. I mean, computer majors.
I wish I could show you the 3 pages of questions that I have left, but I'm being given a sign saying that I have 10 minutes left till questions. Oh, okay, good, thank you. I did want to get at this, and I apologize if this is a clumsy question, but it has to do with this idea of you know, showing you a Google page and saying, look, it's the internet. Or, you know, you mentioned in the book sometimes this idea of someone believing that the whole world spoke their language because it's the best language and ate their food because it's the best. And then we're looking at the slideshow, and there's a building with a big sign on top that says, we are happy. And there's this sort of surreal stuff, and almost as a self-defense mechanism, I find myself wanting to impose an almost cartoonish perception of this, that this is funny somehow or something. And it's almost as a self-defense mechanism because I know that the reality that lies behind this is essentially, I think you described it in one of your talks as a gulag posing as a nation. And so I'm wondering, when you write this book, how frustrating is it to get at the heart of the reality of what's happening in this place and the very terrible reality, but then also know that you exist in a part of the world where the defining mainstream definition is a cartoon almost?
I mean, I just think, I mean, I get very angry. I realize I get really, really bad about that. But beyond that, it's really made me think about things like, I think that for a long time you wonder, like in college and stuff, you're like, wow, like how did the Nazi Germany happen where people are being gassed, millions are being gassed, and what were there not journalists then, and were there not activists? Like, you think about this, I mean, not like, thousands of people are being gassed, but millions are being gassed. So, but I think I finally have an answer. I think that we objectify and make them into the other, make them into a cartoon. I mean, movies like Interview, they do a very successful job at aiding that perception of dehumanization of North Korea, so they're no longer human beings. Any sensational reports you get is very similar. Because if they were like you and me and living in that world, they're not allowed to move within the country either. They have to get a permission to go from here to Denver. Like there's a checkpost between each town. They're never allowed to move. I mean, if it was like our sons living in that world, how could we sleep at night? So, I mean, I think it's devastating, and I think it's unacceptable that this has become some sort of a funny jokes. Mm-hmm. I don't care what Kim Jong-un's newest hairdo is, or how fat he is, and all this stuff that you see in sometimes very just mainstream report. And it's shocking to me that that's the level of analysis of North Korea.
I wanted to ask you, just as a journalist myself, I'm fascinated by the logistical challenge of writing a book while you're in North Korea. Just how did you go about taking notes? How did you go about working on? Because I presume you couldn't have just memorized everything you wanted to write and then come back and write it. I mean, what was the day-to-day life when you're being monitored all of the time?
So Minder was living directly below my bedroom. So, and his job is watching me 24/7. Classroom is recorded, rooms are bugged, and I'm not allowed to leave. Because I'm a teacher, I could have the laptop. So I created a document that was looked like a school lesson, and the book would begin page 100. Then I saved them on tiny USB sticks I wore, like a jewelry. I brought tiniest USB sticks that I could find. I brought several of them. So I wore them on my body and had them on my body at all times, and erased and deleted every trace of it from the laptop every time I signed off, morning and night, because I would write at 4 a.m. and then at night I had a notebook with me, which I carry. So if the conversations were happen, if I can't type it up, I would write it down as if it's a school note, and then try to memorize it, rip it up. I mean, so it was all of that. Creating a SD card backup, hiding in different places, turning the light off in the room. Because I know they go through the stuff, and if these notes were captured, then clearly, I mean, that would be spying, espionage, right? So,
there's a portion in the book where you describe the sort of advice you were given. I mean, advice is a soft word, but the things you should and shouldn't do, and it was sort of bullet points, a lot of which boiled down to better to just keep your head down and not say anything. If someone talks about this particular problematic topic, then just say, oh, is that so? And then, carry on. But you're also with these students, and you know that a lot of the things they believe about the outside world are essentially imposed fantasy. Was there ever a temptation to just say, no, this isn't how the rest of the world works? Did you ever have that desire to just say, here's something true about the world outside this world?
I mean, I think of North Korea as the biggest abused home, almost they're all abused. But to be inside an abusive cult is an incredibly stressful position, because I think that fear is all the time, and then also reliving what you might have said and not said all the time. So if I'm saying something to a student, of course, if they say kimchi is known as the best world in the world, kimchi is a Korean pickled cabbage. It's a great dish, but it's not being hailed around the world as the best dish. I mean, come on, let's be a bit realistic. I mean, but I couldn't correct them. They said it was voted also as the official Olympic food in Atlanta. I suppose they insisted this with me, and so then you just you learn to not say, but then sometimes you're just so dying to say something, because if you love them, it's so heartbreaking. They're just so also bright. These kids are lovely and bright. So I think that what I was constantly battling with there was, the fear is, of course, for your own life, but fear is getting someone else killed. And that double fear, as I say something, and then what if they're rounded up and get killed was just always there. And it's one of the most stressful things to be responsible for someone else's life.
Mm-hmm. Do I have time for one more, or should we go to Q&A? I just wanted to ask you about fiction. Before you wrote this book, you wrote a novel called The Interpreter, which I guess nominally is a murder mystery. But I read, at least from my personal experiences, it struck me as this really brilliant novel about belonging when you belong to more than one culture. And I'm just wondering what drew you initially to fiction, and what sort of questions you go to address when you go down that route as opposed to going the nonfiction route.
I mean, I think the fiction ended up being my novel, The Interpreter. I was also working for the book as an interpreter, because I think being able to interpret two different cultures is a very interesting position. Ultimately, I think that I ended up doing basically that for North Korea also. I think the fiction, in that device was a perfect, the mystery of murder, but it was never really about murder. It was really about identity. And I think that ended up being the right device for that. But for North Korea, it actually, from my first visit, never occurred to me that I'm going to do this as fiction, because reality was more fictioner than the fiction. So with North Korea, the responsibility really was about how accurately, vividly I can capture this, because no matter what I say, it's really hard to believe. But how do I then bring the reality of that world and also deliver the humanity that's in there? Because the surface of North Korea is so brutal, so bizarre, that people don't somehow see humanity is in there. And that I thought was the most important thing. And to bring humanity is only when, empathy happens when we feel humane. And these things are all interconnected. So I thought that here it's actually like capture the most bright light of this place in nonfiction. So the challenge was a very different challenge.
And with that, let's turn it to the audience. Please let us know if you have a question. We have a mic. And when you ask a question, please let us know who you are.
First hand in the back.
Thank you, Ann Waldman. And I want to say it's just an extraordinary presentation, so brave and so heartfelt, and thank you so much and for your book. I wanted to ask about the karma of the Korean War. And of course, the implication with this playing out of the Cold War with China and the U.S. and others involved, and I know the loss of life was quite, people don't even talk about it. I know the U.S., I think, lost at least 33,000 soldiers and probably thousands of Koreans. Maybe you could talk about that. But I wondered, what the feeling, you mentioned earlier something about the war as some sort of impact and the hatred of America. So I'm just curious about that.
Thank you for that question. That's actually a very, very important question, because that's where this all began. People are now focused on Kim Jong-un, but they forget the origin of it all. So Korea is when, in 1945, when Korea is divided, that was really, so when people talk about Korean War dividing Korea, that's not what it was. Korea was already divided in 1945 by the United States and the Allies and Russia. So it was suddenly split into two. It was 1943 Cairo conference actually that decided that at the end of World War II, what are we going to do with Korea? Korea was one nation kingdom until about 1910, and it gets colonized by Japan. And in 1945, it's liberated. So when it's liberated, instead of being liberated, they just split into two. So Russia took over North, and America took over South. They put their generals that they appointed. For Russia, was the original great leader. For South, it was American hand-picked dictator. So there was already, so many people were dying under that dictatorship in the southern side, and the Soviet side then decided to just take over. And that's when the war happened. And when the war happened, the death is just random line that just they decided to cut. but it killed about 20% of the Korean civilian population. Most of those people are in the north side. So then this handpicked dictator in the northern side, North Korea now we have, then use the hatred, because always when dictators come, they use the national security as the reason why they need to control the nation. So hatred of the United States is directly related to the philosophy of the great leader. To uphold this utter devotion to the great leader, it's because America is going to attack them any second. So this hatred of the United States goes back to 1945. So when people suddenly say, like, as if, suddenly in North Korea, why are they mad at us? I mean, that's the foundation of North Korea. And the foundation comes from actually splitting an ancient nation that's 5,000 years old that prides itself on family values. Confucianism, that's what Korea is. So it's all about the national spirit, national foundation is all based on families. So to cut them, millions of families got separated. Beyond all those other 20% of the population dying, I think that has a repercussion. I think in my book I describe Korea as a diseased nation, because I don't know how you can be okay. So what we're seeing is, in a way, consequence of that.
Is it also true that it's not referred, it still is not in America, textbooks called a war? It was a police action.
I think it's actually not referred. I mean, casually it's described as a forgotten war. I mean, scholars might have forgotten about it, but media has. But when you go to even South Korea today, it's references everywhere. When you're in North Korea, their language is all about war. Citizens are described as a bullet to serve the weapon for the great leader. I mean, classroom was described as not described, the word they use, because language also turns violent. I think people forget. Korean is the same Korean, North and South, but language is unbelievably violent. And I think the society does reflect in language. I mean, it's horrifying to hear the Korean language used in North Korea, even in newspapers and stuff. But also they describe the classroom, the selection of the word is a platoon instead of a classroom. The workplace is called a battlefield because it's all about war. Also, North Korean young men serve mandatory army service of 10 years.
Are you going down front?
That was very compelling. Thank you. My name is Rahul Mehra. I just have a quick question. Given your very different perspective, sort of on the ground floor of North Korea, what do you see as a solution looking forward? I know it's a tough question.
I mean, I think that North Korea, they say, is the biggest failure of foreign policy, and also the biggest failure in journalism. It's not a problem they've been able to solve for over 70 years. I think that it is an unworkable issue. I mean, it's so disingenuous to pretend North Korea is going to give up nuclear weapons when its only mode of survival is nuclear weapons. So, and they also think that, like China, they would slowly, moderate this great leader system. But I mean, you see that. How do you moderate that system? It's like expecting the biggest cult to be like a little bit less of a cult. So, I mean, it's just not a workable scenario. War is not possible because it's situated right next to China, Russia, Japan, and South Korea. So you're not going to start a war with a country that is right next to China, because that's a war with China, especially a nuclear war. So there is literally, I mean, also it's a land of lies. We haven't even covered that, right? I mean, this whole place is built on lies. Lying is encouraged all the time. It's very difficult to research North Korea because lies are rampant. So you're also trying to negotiate with a country that is never going to honor those negotiations. So in every way, you hit a dead end. So then, as unfeasible, impossible as it is some change would have to happen from inside, which can only happen from outside, meaning you have to just pour resources in there. I don't see any other way. Most of it is going to go to build weapons, but maybe the dribbles and dribbles of it could get to people, and maybe, and you know, one of really light, I think, is Kim Jong-un being really rash. You know, if he's getting his brother killed, he's getting uncle killed, he's not as collected as a great leader. He also doesn't quite have the support of the people because he's so young. Because other people, his father had years to prepare, but Kim Jong-un just didn't. This whole air thing, then he became the great leader. So because he doesn't quite have the support of the people, I think it's the only light. So then how can any maybe, you know, disagreement can happen inside? I mean, even that's a dead end because the citizens themselves are also psychologically abused by cult for the last 3 generations. So we're also dealing with people who are psychologically damaged. But, you know, I think this problem, the only possibility, China has no incentive to help really in this situation, the whole sanctions and all of that. They don't want the refugees. I mean, they just kind of are enabling North Korea. So literally, I think the only thing to do is, and that is almost nearly impossible, is pour resources in. And then some movements can happen from inside.
My name is Ujjwala Dikshit. I'm from Pennsylvania. Thank you so much. I'm tongue-tied. English language will have to, or all languages will have to coin a word superlative to the word courage. Hats off. I wanted to sort of bring you, alluded to it in the talk a little bit, The State of Mind documentary by Daniel Gordon, which is actually about the mass dancing that occurs, I think, annually in North Korea. And you did allude to some dancing, which I sort of put 2 and 2 together. Right? In that documentary, Daniel also showed a few interviews with different citizens. A couple of them were scientists, and something tells me one of them was a physicist. Although he sort of agreed to what the government is doing is correct, like rationing food, eating only half a bowl of soup in 24 or 48 hours, and the journey that Daniel followed about the 2 girls and their families for this dance. But that scientist showed a very, very sad and disturbed face when he responded to the questions. In your experience, when you were staying there through your students, did you see anyone showing that we know that this is wrong, but we can't help it?
I mean, you know, I think, of course, that's, the thing is, I think that, imagine it has just like abused cult. Then, even if there's a doubt, there's also not a doubt. Sometimes believing and disbelief can coexist. Sometimes you think something's not quite right, but you also worship your great leader. So I think we forget to look at North Korea as actually complex human beings. So even if you think, I know some of this isn't the way it is, but I can't really show that to you because everybody's watching. Also, every North Korean has to go to a meeting once a week to report on each other. So there's a system of surveillance. So whatever you're saying is being watched by everyone else. And it's going to have consequences, often it's going to cause some problem with your family. So your families can be persecuted. So, for example, the uncle, when Chang Sung-taek was killed, it was sort of known that everyone in any relatives related to them were all executed, including children. So the brutality level is just beyond what our imagination can go. So the fear is one thing. Then there's a cult thing. So, you know, you could be very confused. You know, I would have students tell me that he cloned a rabbit in 5th grade. It's clear he did not clone a rabbit in 5th grade. So I felt like even as he was kind of saying it, he might not believe it. But he says it anyway, because that's what you're supposed to do. And part of him, I think, also believed it too. And I think this is kind of what we have to understand. And then I think that if we can equate it to maybe a tightly controlled cult and a military dictatorship, then I think we begin to see maybe you can be kind of multiple of those things.
It's almost like the national stuff.
No, it's like doubt and faith can coexist.
Hello, my name's Jim Guadani from California. Now, you studied this area for 10 years before you went over there. How could you go over there realistically believing you could be an investigative reporter, knowing that there's going to be a minder all the time with you? Everywhere you went, people were watching. You couldn't take pictures they wouldn't let you take. How can you be an investigative reporter under those circumstances?
Because I'm living with them. You know, I think maybe this goes back to our question of being a fiction writer, is that you're not doing fiction, but you know with language you can deliver this. You can deliver the fear, you can deliver the sentences. You know, for example, they would say to me, teacher, I will come and say goodbye to you. None of them were allowed to do that. They said it 5 times. 20-year-old young men, they were in the building next to mine. They couldn't walk over to say goodbye to me. But the fact that they would say it over and over and over and over and over that day, each time they would say that, my heart would just sink. Because why is he saying it knowing he's not allowed? Because children do that. You know, because as if you say it enough times, it might happen. So I realized after he said it about 5 times that day alone, that he just wants to tell me, I wish I could come and say goodbye to you, but I'm not allowed to, but I want you to know I would if I could. None of that was said, but I think my job as a literary writer was to deliver that sentiment. And I think that's, you know, and I don't know what other investigative journalism there can be. When you're embedded, it's note-taking of every single moment in dialogue. And also what it looked like.
I apologize. I know we have tons more questions, but that's the end of it. Suki, thank you so much for this. And thank you all, everybody.
Thank you.